there is an assumption that the both teams hold and the CEOs or founders and entrepreneurs hold, which is they've kind of got to have the answers. And so to reach out means that they have to be vulnerable and kind of go, you know what, I really don't know. You know, there's several options. There's several ways we could tackle this particular problem, whether it's a growth opportunity or whatever it is. You know, there's multiple ways in which we can do that, and they all have pros and cons. And sometimes that's a real challenge for CEOs to then go, wow, you know, I really don't know what the right answer is here.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining me. I know it is quite late where you are right now, so I really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Thank you. Great to be here, Julian. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, and so I'm curious. I looked at your profile and went through your book, which we'll get into later. And you have an extensive career as a CEO in director positions, and you've had some in the U.S., I believe, and Australia.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what's the biggest difference between the U.S. and Australia, you think? What do you notice the biggest thing?
Oh, wow. That's a tough... you didn't give me any prep for that question, Julian. That's a tough one. Interestingly, you know, I moved... I'm originally from the UK, so I'm a POM. As the Aussies would call me now, I'm a POM. And... you know, so moving from the UK to the US, where I was in the US for 10 years, and then Australia, you know, I kind of see those different kind of different cultures, and it's interesting how, you know, in the UK we're pretty conservative, we're pretty reserved, and everything's got to be kind of proven, if you like. In the States, you know, I found it was a fantastic experience because, you know, the States are full of optimists, and Aussies are somewhere in between. You know, they're kind of a little bit they're a little bit American, and they're a little bit kind of, you know, this is a generalization, of course, but you know, there's definitely some of that British sort of cultural heritage that's kind of infused in the organization, in the culture as well. And you know, I guess you know, environment-wise, Australia is very different, of course. But you know, you can drive down a street in south of Sydney or north of Sydney, and you'll drive by strip malls, and I could swear I was back in a city in the US. You know, so there are definitely similarities. You know, and there's certainly that heritage in Australia where you know, those people that came out exactly the same way. You know, how America grew, you know, 200 years or so ago. You know, that kind of pioneering spirit sort of here. There was you know, a lot for people to overcome to survive. So there's definitely, you know, some similarities in the spirit, I think, of each culture, I'd say.
Yeah, so I'm sure that's brought you to have a unique perspective in terms of how you even advise and even your outlook on business, just to be immersed and exposed to so many different cultures.
Yes, yeah, that's true. And you know, I guess for me it was something that I chose early on, and I do have to say, I guess it's all kind of Western cultures. I haven't had a great deal of kind of exposure to more of the kind of Eastern cultures, but I was very fortunate at a very early age, in really kind of my first real job, I guess, was managing exports from the UK to Europe. And what that meant was I had to travel Europe a lot, and it was the best job I ever had, because it was really, it was all fun and not a lot of responsibility. But anyway, it was really great. So I had the opportunity to you know, get immersed into all the different cultures in Europe, and then from there to then move to the States, which was awesome. and that in itself is kind of interesting because America's it's a continent, so the East is very different to the West, it's very different to the Northwest, to the Southeast. There are lots of differences, cultural differences in the States too, and I was fascinated by that and really inspired by it, and I guess so I kind of engineered my career to to support my travel bug, to be honest. And I really did, because after I left uni, I bummed around Europe for a year doing odd jobs and stuff, and then I kind of woke up and realized, hey, how am I going to get somebody to pay me to do this? So I went back to college and did another degree that got me to the career I'm in now.
So I'm curious, if we go back to like the 13-year-old Anthony, would we be surprised at what that 13-year-old Anthony kind of was trending toward compared to what you're doing now?
Oh yeah, I would say so. Yeah, definitely. And I grew up in what's called the Midlands in the UK, just northeast of Birmingham. And when I grew up there, it was kind of like a small village, and now it's part of the city of Birmingham, and a big kind of conurbation. And so it's literally right in the heart of the country in the UK. And you've got to bear in mind that I know this is difficult for you in America to understand. You got to bear in mind that when we would go out on a Saturday or Sunday with my parents or something, we'd go for a drive. If it was more than 2 hours, we had to stop, and take a packed lunch, because that was so far. To go on a 2-hour drive, that was huge. So when I moved to, anyway, I'll come back to that story. When I moved to America, and understanding the distances was just incredible. So you kind of grow up in that kind of environment. But I was very fortunate to when I went to university, I did a degree in history and politics, just because I was interested in those subjects, and so I moved to a different town, north of England, to Hull University, and that was just a fantastic experience that really kind of opened my mind. The whole study, the whole environment, culture at university was awesome, and it really kind of expanded my mind from kind of growing up in this fairly very country style kind of village. So, and I think once my mind was open and I started traveling, kind of that was it. I just wanted to do more of it, and I was always interested in finding out about cultures and put myself in those situations where it was kind of difficult to communicate and stuff, and I just loved it. And I guess not everybody's like that, but I mean, it sort of it infused my thinking, so that really now, in terms of when I look at my career, which has meant I've worked in the UK, Europe, in the US, and now Australia, and pretty much most of my career has been in organizations that have been focused on building international businesses. And that's kind of been my focus. So the 13-year-old would definitely not have recognized that, would not recognize that at all, because he would have had to say, hang on a second, you mean we're going more than 2 hours? Got to take that packed lunch. To now, realizing time is different. Every business is global today, kind of once you're on the web. So time differences are irrelevant. You just kind of make yourself available, and different world from that 13-year-old. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I had no clue what the hell I was going to do when I was 13. No clue.
Yeah. So, how'd you get involved? And I think I've seen that it's mostly services, manufacturing, distribution industries, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. What led you particularly to those industries?
Well, I was very fortunate. After I did my uni degree, I kind of bummed around Europe, and then I went back and I did a postgraduate degree. Actually, this is kind of interesting because I did a 2-year postgraduate in a very specialized course, which was called export marketing. Mm-hmm. And that was 50% languages. So we did intensive French and German classes and 50% business. But the interesting thing about it was a 2-year course. And in the second year, the university kind of created a marketing company, and we, the students, and there was a small cohort. There was only about 25 of us. It was quite an interesting and innovative program back in its time, and we actually formed a company, formed an organization as such, and we did market research for UK companies wanting to export, and it's kind of sort of how I got my first taste. And in fact, I worked with a company, John Cleese's company. I don't know if you know the name John Cleese, now older, famous kind of comedian from the Monty Python crew. And he had a training company doing video training. And so I and a couple of my other fellow students did a research program into the US, interestingly enough, to introduce these products into America. So at a very relatively young age, in my very early 20s, I was actually interviewing video producers and distributors in Hollywood. And I took a trip to Hollywood and got that experience, which was just kind of amazing. Anyway, it kind of opened my mind, I guess. And so I was very fortunate to get that first role out of having done that course, looking after these exports in Europe for a UK manufacturing business that sold to distributors and kind of wholesale. And then after 3 years of doing that role, they basically tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, do you want to go and set up the business in America for us?" And I guess it was that journey, and having done that for sort of 10 years in the States. After I moved to Australia, I did a couple of other CEO roles, and then started my consulting practice. And then in my consulting practice, worked with a lot of other manufacturers and service businesses too. So there's kind of a lot more in my consulting practice.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive into the book a little bit. The CEO Game Changer. I guess the first question that we always like to know from authors is, what was the inspiration to actually do this book?
Yeah, that's great. So having been a CEO myself, I talked about moving to America. So when I moved to America back in 1988, I literally lived in a hotel. Found a warehouse, hired some people, brought some product in, and started flying around the country trying to sell it. And I had this, and I built this perfect plan. That was a 45-degree plan that showed revenue increasing at 45 degrees, profit increasing at 45 degrees. Didn't quite work out that way, but hey, it was great learning for me. So I did that CEO role there, where I learned a hell of a lot as I built that business, and ended up acquiring 2 businesses as well in that kind of process. Then I did a couple of CEO roles in Australia too, and the reality is, the life of a CEO is kind of what I call commercially lonely. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that the CEO is the fountain of inspiration and motivation for their team. They're the person who clearly articulates the kind of the vision. They're seen as the leader of the organization, and they're seen as the leaders of the organization not only just from their staff, but also their leadership team, their fellow shareholders, their fellow executive directors, and even if they are reporting to a board of directors. Everyone wants to know that the CEO ultimately has the right answer. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, and most CEOs have pretty robust egos and stuff, so they're pretty bulletproof. But there are those times, when we're tired, stressed, all of those things, or when very complex challenges that CEOs have to face, where it's tough to make those decisions. And there aren't always that kind of environment where you can have vulnerable conversations within your own team when they're looking to you for answers. And certainly that might be the case, with a board. So that's a common trait for all CEOs, to have what I call this kind of commercially lonely kind of perspective. And I've spent my career working with what I call private companies. So they are typically companies that are kind of established. They're often owner founders, and they might range from, I don't know, 50 staff to 200 staff, something in that kind of range. And so they're kind of entrepreneurial businesses that are often in growth mode. And so they are not large enough, what I would kind of say, to have what I would call a fully qualified leadership team. People in leadership in the business who have both deep domain expertise, but also broad commercial expertise. They're just not large enough to have that kind of expertise. So they kind of have to figure stuff out. And there's really those two choices of, you can kind of, you can figure it out yourself and find your own pathway, or the better option is to have people around you, a network of advisors that have the expertise that you can't afford to bring in-house yet, and may also have been on the journey already that you're planning to go on, right? And that structure is what I call, an advisory board, which is different from a board of directors, and I can talk about that a little bit in a second. But the point is, in my CEO roles, I didn't have an advisory board. I did report to a board of directors, which were different things. But I've now established numerous advisory boards with owner-founder companies, built teams of advisors that are fit for purpose for those businesses, and I've seen the transformational impact that can have on those CEOs. And having seen that experience numerous times, and the value of that in better decision making, better performing businesses, less stress, all of those things, which are the challenges when you kind of run a business. Having seen that and experienced that, and knowing that not many businesses use this structure. So I wanted to create the book that kind of says, here's a structure for the right CEO, the right organization, I think can be a tremendous support to those CEOs to enable them to get where they want to go faster and more efficiently, in the most effective way. And so I decided to write the book to kind of say, this is a great model for the right organization, and it's actually not that hard to put together. So that's kind of why I wrote the book, which is to get that message out there, that I think for the right CEOs, it's an ideal model of advice.
Yeah, you mentioned commercially lonely, and and also you mentioned that a lot of CEOs kind of have an ego, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs as well. And it's a good thing. It's necessary, especially when
it creates the drive.
Yeah. Especially when you're building something from the ground up. You have to have a little bit of that when maybe the outside world is not indicating what you're seeing in your head. So my thing is, why do you think it's so difficult, probably, that maybe it is to reach out and deal with this when it's lonely and you're dealing with all these things internally? But why is it so hard for a lot of these leaders to kind of reach out and seek this support and help?
That's a great question, and I think it comes down to that point that I made, though, that there is an assumption that the both teams hold and the CEOs or founders and entrepreneurs hold, which is they've kind of got to have the answers, and so to reach out means that they have to be vulnerable and kind of go, you know what, I really don't know. There's several options. There are several ways we could tackle this particular problem, whether it's a growth opportunity or whatever it is. There's multiple ways in which we can do that, and they all have pros and cons. And sometimes that's a real challenge for CEOs to then go, wow, I really don't know what the right answer is here. And I think it's difficult because those egos are there, and we naturally, a lot of people are not comfortable in being that vulnerable, and yet the advantage, or rather I'd say the CEOs that choose to have an advisory board are those that are happy to be vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And so the point of my book is to try to say to those that might not consider it because they don't want to be vulnerable, to kind of go, this is a great model for you. You should explore it.
So earlier in the book, there was these stages that CEOs can find themselves in, and in particular, there was a stage called the fighting for position stage. And what does that stage feel like on a day-to-day basis? And I guess also, why is it so hard to kind of break free from that particular stage?
Yeah, cool. I talk about there are 4 stages, and we might talk about the other 2 stages a little bit later too. And the first stage is kind of starting up. You're an entrepreneur starting a business. It's those first 2 or 3 years where every new customer is 100% improvement than what you kind of had before, and it really is validating that your product or service, there is a market for it, all of those sorts of things. And then eventually you get to this point where the business has got some size. You've got a team, you've got customers, and you can be growing, but you're not really what I call breaking through. You're not a well-known brand. You are fighting for the next customer, fighting for that position in the marketplace. And the reason why it's challenging is because it takes capital. It takes a focused team, it takes the right strategy, and all those things are kind of hard work. And it's very, very easy for an organization at that stage to be not really clear about where it's going. And it's also where customers actually can drive the nature of a business. So if a big customer comes to you at that stage and says, hey, can you supply this kind of product or this kind of service for us? And at that stage, even if that product or service isn't quite right for what the organization is doing, when a large customer comes along and says, hey, can you do this for us? Most people are opportunistic and kind of respond to it and go, yeah, we'll do that. We'll go and do that. But that might be a distraction. It might be the right way, but it might be a distraction that actually takes them away from really what their vision is. And so I would say the reason why they can't break out is because there isn't that clarity of vision, there isn't that clarity of strategy. It's about just getting more business. And so the way to break out of it is to get that clarity of vision. Now, what is it? The other part of the question was, what does it feel like when you're on the inside? It feels like a roller coaster. It feels like a roller coaster because you bounce from the great highs when that new customer that you've been chasing for a while suddenly comes on board, and you kind of go, wow, that's fantastic. And then you find the next week that the previous great customer that you had decided to leave and cancel your products and services, or didn't sign that contract, etc. You go from winning the business to then try to find the cash to support the growth for that business. You go from having a team of people with you who helped you set up the business and get it to where it is, but you get to the realization that they're actually probably not the team that are going to take you to the next stage of growth, just because they don't have the skill sets that you can see already that you will need. So it's a tough place to be, and it's a cauldron. And most CEOs are robust enough to try to keep going, but I would suggest a lot of them get hung up in this position. and their business can grow, but because they don't have that clarity of strategy, they're not known in an industry for something specifically. That it can be a challenging environment for them, and that can go on for years, for many, many years. And in my consulting practice, I'd have lots of business owners come to me and kind of go, I started this thing 5 years ago. I wanted to achieve X, do this, have this impact on the market. I've ended up doing something completely different because 2 or 3 big customers helped me, wanted me to go and do stuff over here. And now I look at this business and I go, why am I doing this thing? This isn't what I started out to do. And kind of a way out of that is to help them re-clarify, what that vision, what that North Star is, and to kind of get the right strategy, which is the next transition stage.
So I'm curious, what makes a advisory, somebody might think this, what makes an advisory board fundamentally different compared to, say, having different consultants or even joining different peer groups? I get pitched maybe every week or so to join this entrepreneur group, join this CEO group. Yeah. What makes it different?
That's right. You could join mine, Julian. I host my own peer-to-peer CEO group too, and I do talk about this in the book. All of those different models are relevant, right? So if you're a entrepreneur CEO in that fighting for position mode, it's the one thing to do is to get advice, is to get help. Because just by having an alternative perspective and really helps you think through and hone your own thinking around what you kind of want to do with this business. So there are business coaches that can help you get clarity in terms of mindset and focus, which is fantastic. There are consultants that typically would come in and help you on a particular project, whether it's a digital transformation exercise or some sort of mapping exercise, some sort of market research exercise, etc. But they kind of have one blinkered focus, which is kind of resolve that issue there and then. A coach can be very good for you, but they tend to be very general and kind of more around your kind of mindset focus. An advisory board is very different. An advisory board has selected advisors with the skill sets that your business needs for the future, but that you can't yet afford to hire staff with those skill sets internally. So it kind of gives you fractional access to that expertise that you need. And there's a structure to it. So there's regular meetings, monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, whatever those kind of that framework is that you kind of choose. But it also that expertise falls out of what the strategic plan looks like. So for me, getting out of that fighting for position requires a clear vision and strategic plan. And when you do a strategic plan, that always inevitably identifies the gap in capability of kind of what you need to be able to achieve that vision 3 to 5 years hence and what you've got now. And an advisory board can fill that gap, with the right skill sets. So the skills of who you put on your advisory board fall out of what that strategy is and where the gap is in your own kind of leadership.
Okay. So I have 2 questions on that. I guess the first one is, for the advisory board, is the owner having to give up equity to do, are they giving up equity or something to do this? Or I guess what's in it for the advisory board?
Yeah, so that's a model. I mean, I'm certainly somebody who believes that, and one of the opportunities of an advisory board is it's a flexible model. It's not like a structured model like a board of directors, and that's why I really like it, because
that was going to be the next question.
It's got that flexibility that the CEO can stop it, the CEO can start it, the CEO decides who's on it, etc. So they've got that ultra flexibility. But you touched on that issue of kind of remuneration, and I know of advisory boards where people have been on an advisory board and they're a very successful business person, etc., and they just want to help. They just want to help entrepreneurs and stuff. And that's great. That's fantastic. It's really fabulous. It's fabulous for the entrepreneur. But that's not what I'm talking about in the book. And the reason why I think that's great but insufficient is because there isn't mutual obligation.
Right.
There isn't mutual obligation, and because I'm suggesting that an advisory board is a kind of a professional body. You've got to have people on that advisory board who are vested in your success and kind of want to make you successful. So I think there has to be a remuneration exchange there. Now, one way you can do that, and certainly it's very, very common in early stage startups, and certainly early stage startups in the tech or fintech kind of side of the kind of business to engage with equity. Alternatively, you can just pay fees for those members.
Okay.
But I do believe that the remuneration creates that mutual obligation that says, I as an advisor, I'm committed to your success.
And so I guess that's it. We slightly touched on the difference between the advisory board and the governance board, and it seems like flexibility is a huge difference between having the advisory board and the governance board. Yeah,
that's right. And a couple of differences. One is a board of directors is governed under company law, and I'm sure this is the same in America too, and we have a corporations law in Australia, and so there is a legal requirement. There is a legal framework for a board of directors when they are kind of looking at a company. So, and effectively, the board of directors looks after the company as a whole, not necessarily the CEO, which is why you see CEO changes a lot. Whereas an advisory board is focused on the success of that CEO and their business. And it's a very much a commercial focus that is designed to help them get through that fighting for position stage. So unlike a board of directors, which has to look at all parts of the business and kind of says, reputation, work health and safety, OHS, and all aspects of the business, an advisory board can be very focused on the commercial outcome that a CEO is looking for. And I think that's a key difference. And that flexibility point is ultimately it's the CEO that decides who's on their advisory board, what's the skill sets that they kind of have. The CEO decides the frequency of meetings, and the CEO also has the choice, even though they've selected the right kind of advisors. Sometimes the CEOs are going to kind of go, yeah, I really appreciate that advice, but I don't agree with you. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go on this other pathway. That's not the case really with a board of directors. If that happens too many times, the board of directors can say, I think we want to change the CEO. Whereas the CEO, the advisor has, so they really kind of have those advisors that they can go, I'm going to take my challenge to this group of trusted advisors. I already have in my mind what I think I want to achieve. They can hone and help me hone that kind of perspective, or they might have a different perspective. And ultimately the CEO can say, yep, thanks, but I'm not going to do that. Now, that raises some challenges, because if that happens at every meeting, either the advisory board is wrong, or the CEO is wrong. One of the two is wrong.
Yeah, that's what I would be thinking there. And so, I was looking at, as I went through the book, you referenced some data about there was a 24% higher sales, 18% higher productivity for companies with advisory boards. But, and I was thinking about this, that I want to go beyond the numbers here, because I think there's a parallel with health as well. Because a lot of times people may look at just something surface like this here of like, hey, how's my weight doing and all that. But there's so many other good things happening that we know the plan is working. So my question here is, what signals should a CEO look for to know that their advisory board is working beyond the obvious?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really great. So one of the things that I challenge CEOs to do if they set up an advisory board is at the end of every meeting, and I suggest advisory board meetings can be either monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly, depending on the scale and complexity of the business, etc. But the CEO at the end of every meeting has to say, is that the best 2 hours, best use of my time for the last 2 hours? So that's one of the key measures, which is, and if they come out of that and go, that was really great because it challenged my thinking, I've got some new ideas, I'm really focused, I'm really clear about now what I want to achieve, what the pathway looks like, how I'm going to do it, I now feel great and confident. So end of every meeting is they've got to kind of ask themselves, what was that the best use of my time? And hopefully it's more times like that than it's not. But then of course, from an advisory board it's all about, it's focused around the development and implementation of that strategy. So the advisory board has to be helping and holding to account the CEO to stay focused on that strategy. Mm-hmm. One of the real challenges for CEOs running any kind of business, certainly in that early stage business, is focus, right? Because there are so many challenges. There are people challenges. That person, that senior leader that you think is going to be fantastic suddenly leaves and takes another job. Your focus is caught on that. It's cash, it's marketing, it's trademarks, it's all of those things. It's very, very easy for a CEO to I guess focus on the operational aspects of a business rather than necessarily, the real structure of kind of where we're going. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting your point about health though too, because I think, the advantage of an advisory board is not just for the CEO, because it sort of helps the leadership team as well, because once the CEO has that clarity, the advisory board can help the CEO in terms of the capability of the leadership team, the coherence of the leadership team, how effectively they are working together. And, I have seen personally businesses that have been unsuccessful because there's a CEO might have a great heart and a real passion, but it's just not good at making the right kind of decisions. And those businesses go out of business. And that's bad, because I believe that the business is a success. The success of a business is not just in making the CEO and the shareholders wealthy, but it's all of the staff and the customers and the suppliers. There's an eco chamber there, and for me, the passion of an advisory board is if we can make those businesses more effective, that whole ecosystem develops and builds. Mm-hmm. So I guess those measures around health would be, the link to health would be one, the CEO's mindset, right? Mm-hmm. Because they can come into a meeting very confused, very challenged, lots of priorities, but then leave with a laser focus about kind of what they've got to do. They get a real sense of, I'm not alone. There's mm-hmm. other people that have experienced the same challenge that I have. They've got the problem shared as a problem halved. But they also then get to the opportunity to look at their business in a dispassionate and objective way, which is very difficult when you're kind of inside the business. And certainly, an advisory board is gonna coach a CEO to go, if they're not looking after their health. I almost talk about, one of the jobs of the advisory board is they think of the CEO as their thoroughbred racehorse, and part of their job is to make sure that racehorse is well trained, well fed, and but that's just an analogy for the organization as well. If the CEO's in great condition, there's a very, very good chance that the rest of the business can be too.
Yeah. So that was going to be one of my next questions, was actually to go over that aspect, because I was curious if actually when we're having these advisory meetings, is like the CEO's health and resilience, energy management, all that stuff, is it part of the actual advisory board conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be. There's no question. And when you sit in an advisory board, you can tell when a CEO is really stretched and really stressed. It's easy for advisors to see where a CEO is not in their best condition. I also talk about, in the book, I talk about what I call a CEO multiplier effect, which is the fact that everything that the CEO does and does not do in an organization is seen by everybody, and sets the tone for the organization. When the CEO kind of walks in the morning and they're grumpy, they don't talk to people, that sets a vibe in the organization. When they come in and they're upbeat and they're energetic and they're focused, that sets a vibe. So I talk about that CEO multiplier effect as a significant off-balance sheet measure of success. And so the advisory board's job is to kind of say, hey, you're really not in tip-top shape at the moment. You got to take that holiday. You got to take that time out. You got to take that, do that health retreat. You got to look after yourself, etc. You can't be working 24/7, 7 days a week for months on end. And there's no question that has to be part of the part of the discussion for the advisors.
As AI is growing now, we have different global situations going on, and then there's always going to be new market dynamics that are going to accelerate various things. How do you see advisory boards evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and hopefully they will be physical people as well as avatars. But I have no question that we will be using AI in those advisory board meetings in real time, with avatars that have very specific domain expertise. Whether that is digital marketing, whether that is certain types of tech, whether that is supply chain management, etc. There is no question that we will be using digital twins that have specific expertise. I just said, how you create an advisory board is to look at your strategic plan and go, I really need that digital marketing expert, but I can't quite afford somebody that's had global expertise in that yet. I can imagine in 12 months or less, we can create those avatars that'll sit around that room and help us. And I see that as a tremendous benefit, particularly for private companies where advisory boards offer the greatest impact. Because larger organizations can already afford those resources and that thinking and that people sitting around the table with that breadth and depth of kind of commercial experience. Whereas, so these are going to be great tools for those private companies, earlier stage businesses. And that's another, I talk about the leapfrog effect quite a lot. It's another one of those kind of examples where there's opportunities for CEOs to leapfrog. So I think it's really exciting, really exciting.
Yeah, and so I'm going to pivot a little bit and go through a round of just some random questions that I'm just coming to the top of my head. And so one of those is, what's one lesson that you would give to your younger CEO self from 20 years earlier?
Yeah, from 20 years earlier, it would have been when I was a CEO myself.
Yes.
Get an advisory board. I didn't have one. I didn't have one. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know what they were, and I tried to figure it out. I read as much as I could, and I put myself in as many places, networking and all those kind of things, and I tried to figure it out. And I figured it out. I ultimately figured it out. But that takes blood, sweat, and tears, and energy, and a lot of effort. I talk about when I first started that business in America after moving over from the UK. I did work 24/7 for probably the first 3 years, and that's crazy. what I really needed to do, if I could think back, if I could go back to that time, was to go, there's 3 people I know that if I'd have caught up with every 2 months, they would have just pushed that business along, helped me push it along. So it would have been pick those perfect kind of mentors that can be my advisory board. And again, I use that term mentor. An advisory board is like a structured mentoring program. Not the mentoring where you catch up with a buddy or somebody you respect and you have those conversations. It's kind of like having really experienced mentors, but who are structured to show up to meetings, to deliver, to read your information and contribute. So yeah, my advice to my 20 years ago would have been, get an advisory board.
Yeah. So at this point, you said in dozens of boardrooms. And so if you can remember, I'm curious, what's maybe the most unusual piece of advice you've ever heard someone give a CEO?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Aside from sell the company and get the hell out, I don't know. The most interesting piece of advice. That's a challenging question, but my mind goes to. I'm a passionate advocate for advisory boards, as you can hear. But sometimes they don't work, and sometimes advisors don't work. And I talk about in the book about you got to have the right people with the right culture who kind of works with you, etc. But it doesn't always work. I had an advisor, been involved in an advisory board where we had a gentleman who'd been very successful building and selling a couple of businesses, who was right in the kind of a sweet spot of where my client wanted to go with their business. And that person would sit in these advisory board meetings, and he just got incredibly frustrated with the CEO and owner of the business because he could not make that transition from being an executive himself, directing, to advising. So that probably doesn't answer your question, but it does highlight, that there are challenges with advisory boards too. It's it's not always a perfect scenario, and it needs to be kind of molded. Maybe I'll think about that question again. What's the most interesting piece of advice? It's normally about doing things differently and pivoting. Going at 90 degrees or something, exploring something completely different. I'll think of an example at some stage in the conversation.
And if this was like an alternate universe and you weren't building advisory boards, what do you think you'll be doing right now?
Enjoying my passion for traveling, exposing myself to as many cultures as I possibly can, learning from that and absorbing it. That's kind of what I really enjoy doing. Maybe I'd be a travel agent. Who knows?
Well, these days you can start a YouTube channel, be a travel blogger or something like that.
You could, yeah, absolutely. You can do anything. But I am thinking about setting up. Interesting you say that. I am thinking about now setting up an advisory board podcast. So I need to learn from you, Julian. So,
I think you should. I think you should. So I'll definitely hold you to that if you need somebody to do that.
Okay, awesome.
Because like I said, I don't think there's I don't think there's too many books on advisory boards and too many people that are really just like this is their thing of advisory boards. No, there isn't too much. I mean, I did that research when I was looking at the book, and
that's why I wanted to kind of create this manual. And so the book kind of like, creates the picture, sells the sizzle of what the kind of the benefit can be, but also then kind of gets into a bit of a how-to to make it work too. So it's kind of complete. And the objective of it was to demystify what this model could be like, and what kind of transformational effect it can have on organizations. So yeah, there's not much in this space, and that's my passion now. Is my mission is to get this message out to as many CEOs as I can get it out to.
I'm curious, what is it that you enjoy so much about the advisory boards, and even also hosting the peer-to-peer groups and those kind of connect meetings?
It's seeing the transformation of the people and the success of the businesses. That's the great thing. So earlier on in my consulting career, I did a lot of strategic plans, facilitation for some larger organizations too, and that's really great. It's a fabulous intellectual exercise to get an organization together and a leadership team to scenario plan and think about where the options are, and then make some choices and go. But the really interesting bit is seeing whether it succeeds or not, and that's what you kind of get when you're kind of involved in an advisory board. So it's not a one-time session; it's a long-term commitment to an organization. So seeing organizations develop, seeing CEOs develop, CEOs who all of a sudden their field of vision changes, their focus changes, and over time they then look at how the business has changed, how their people have changed. And I've got numerous kind of examples of that. And people are less stressed too. You talk about the link to the health scenario. It can be very stressful being a CEO of an organization. And when you suddenly come into a room of peers who have similar challenges, everybody's going through some part of that roller coaster. I talk about the roller coaster, or the game of snakes and ladders, which I talks about, which is what it's like running a business. And to see that journey over time, and people build successful businesses, transform themselves, is fantastic. And that's what I really enjoy. Because I've also seen in my career businesses that are not successful, and they're not great places to be. They're not good for society.